Alrighty, so, uh, funny thing, I had it scheduled, this video scheduled for, I've been having it scheduled for quite some time, but I've had to reschedule this video because of different things happening over the weekend. My wife and I were busy, either with work or all those crazy stuff with the holidays, and I've been meaning to get this video out. We've been in the middle of moving. But this audiobook I've been meaning to get out to you guys for quite some time. And I have with me, it's a it's a series on Netflix. I'm not sure if it's still going on right now, but it is a series on Netflix called Painkiller, an Empire of Deceit and the Origin of America's Opioid Epidemic. Not COVID, Oxycontin. The biggest drug before hey, before the drug that's out right now. That's killing people. That's but yeah, this drug came out way long time ago, and it was the biggest thing before COVID hit. So this book is not going to be very long. I'm probably gonna say we'll probably get this done in a few weeks, but I'm excited. I've been meaning to start reading this book to you guys. Um, but yeah, this is a reporter's perspective about what his find. Yeah, it's a he, right? Yeah, I think it's a he. Yeah. His findings on the drug and its causes for it. So, without further ado, let us go ahead and start reading Painkiller. Prologue. Book of the Dead. Within a span of 36 hours in Philadelphia, 9 bodies have been found just blocks away from one another. 5 were inside homes, 2 were in cars, 2 were on the street. The oldest of them was 42. The youngest was 44. They had names, but they would soon become statistics. Data points consumed by a tidal wave of fatal drug overdoses sweeping across the United States. In 2016, 64,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. But let's see, that number equals the population of cities such as Portland, Maine, Lynchburg, Virginia, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was as if in 1 year a plague had entered one of these towns and killed every single inhabitant. It seemed like a horrible high watermark, but the annual overdose death toll kept climbing, and by 2021 had topped 100,000, a jump of 56% in 5 years. Bodies were piling up too fast in some places for medical examiners and coroners to keep up. Morgues were filled to capacity, and corpses had to be stored for days in rented, refrigerated tractor trailers until space became available. Many of the dead were not autopsied. It is standard procedure in a drug overdose case to conduct an autopsy, but if medical examiners had had time to autopsy every victim, some stopped themselves from doing so. Professional groups that accredit medical examiners set a limit on the number of autopsies that a doctor can com, 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 blah, could potentially perform in a year. And examiners in areas with large numbers of overdose deaths would have exceeded that number and risked losing their accreditation. As a result, when overdose victims were discovered near hypodermic needles or pill bottles, they went straight to their graves, unexamined. The vast majority of these deaths involved opioids, prescription painkillers, or illegal drugs derived from compounds either found in the opium poppy or synthesized in a lab. The opioid crisis has become woven in the fabric of everyday American life. In hospitals, newborns separated from the narcotics coursing through the bloodstream of their addicted mothers. And to the world writhing in the pain of opioid withdrawal. On the streets, police officers carry a new piece of standard equipment, a nasal spray containing medicine that could save the life of a person in the midst of an overdose. The epidemic's impact has been so pervasive that life expectancy among white men in the United States has started falling for the first time in more than 20 years. Public officials have called the dramatic response. Lawmakers urge that tens of billions of dollars be spent to treat the addicted. Newspapers, magazines, and television programs are filled with reports about the havoc caused in communities large and small. All this attention makes it seem as if something new is happening. That's not the case. The recent appearance of counterfeit versions of a particularly potent synthetic opioid, fentanyl, that's the name of it, fentanyl, has driven up the body count. But by 2021, some 250,000 Americans had died during the two preceding decades from overdoses involving legal drugs that were produced by pharmaceutical companies and prescribed by doctors. People have been sounding alarms about the mounting death toll linked to prescription painkillers. Still, year after year, politicians, lawmakers, public regulators, professional medical organizations, and insurers have neglected the growing carnage while the pharmaceutical industry has downplayed it. The result is tragic and predictable. By 2021, the number of overdose deaths involving prescription opioids had quadrupled since 1999. A disaster that might have been contained with an early response had morphed into a hydra. Every catastrophe, natural or man-made, has a beginning. Has a beginning. For the opioid crisis, the seed was a drug called Oxycontin. When Oxycontin first appeared in the mid 1990s, it was heralded as a wonder drug that would change how pain, mankind's oldest and most persistent medical enemy, was treated. A determined band of activists laid the groundwork for its arrival by arguing that millions of people were suffering unnecessarily because doctors had exaggerated fears about the addictive potential of prescription painkillers. Doctors had used the term narcotic to describe the active ingredients in such medications. But advocates of more aggressive pain treatment were so eager to distance drugs like Oxycontin from the back alley to connotations of narcotic that, that they coined the word opioid to rebrand them. Oxycontin became the centerpiece of the most aggressive marketing campaign for a powerful and potentially addicting narcotic ever undertaken by the pharmaceutical industry. Its producer, Purdue Pharma, showered millions of dollars on doctors to convince them to prescribe Oxycontin and claimed that it offered not only a better way to treat pain, but a safer one as well. Purdue, which was owned by one of America's wealthiest and most secretive families, the Sacklers, would make billions from the drug sales. This book was first published in 2003. Many of the critical events chronicled in this new and expanded edition had yet to take place. For instance, in 2007, Purdue and the three of its top executives pled guilty to criminal charges in connection with the company's marketing of Oxycontin. With the case's end, I thought my involvement in the story was over. I also labored under the misconception, as journalists often do, that when one stops reporting on a story, the story stops. Unfortunately, that has not proven to be the case. If anything, the Oxycontin episode spawned an era of chaos, corporate profiteering, political entropy, and misery, some of which might have been prevented by federal officials. Following the plea agreements with Purdue and its officials, the Justice Department cons- consigned it to secrecy its its own investigators had uncovered about when Purdue first learned about OxyContin's abuse and what the company did with this crucial information. After a decade of obscurity, scores of internal Purdue emails and other records unearthed by investigators are finally available to shed new light in the origin story of the opioid crisis. Oxycontin was not a wonder drug. It was the gateway drug to the most devastating public health disaster for the 21st century. And that is the end of the epilogue. Let's see, what do we have? Okay. All right. Here we go. I just want to check this out real quick here. All right. So this book is 192 pages, and I hope you guys learned something new from this book. I hope this encourages you and helps you see why you should never ever do drugs, and why this is an important book for you guys to read or listen to in this case. So let's go ahead and continue reading Painkiller. Late on a January night in 2000, telephone rang in the bedroom of a country doctor named Art Van Z. He listened while a nurse at a nearby hospital explained that a young woman had just been brought into the emergency room after overdosing on a painkiller. She was in the intensive care unit on a respirator. It was Van Z's night on call, so he eased out of bed, quietly dressed, and left the house. He drove down a long dirt driveway past a manhunt trout pond and a corral that was home to his children's ponies and donkeys. At the bottom of the driveway, he passed a small concrete building that served as his wife's law office, and then turned right onto a two-lane highway that led from Dryden, Virginia to Pennington Gap, a larger town and the location of Lee County Community Hospital. Art Van Z was 52 and had grown up thousands of miles away from this slice of Appalachia, in the small, high desert of Elko, Nevada. But after 25 years of living in Lee County, he had come to love everything about this place, its landscape, its culture, and its separateness, and it had embraced him as one of its own. Lee County lies in southwestern Virginia, wedged between Kentucky and Tennessee. It is a place of breathtaking beauty as well as an intense poverty. The Cumberland Mountains run through its heart, and over time, fast-running streams have sliced from them steep stony mountain ridges, plunging hollows, and gentle valleys. Stands of lolly pine, shortleaf pine, hickory, and oak rise out of the soil. Below the land are rich veins of coal, the source of Appalachia's wealth and its heartache. Just over the Kentucky border from Lee County is Harlan County, the scene of several violent mine worker strikes, including the 1974 strike that became the subject of an Oscar-winning documentary, Harlan County, USA. Art Van Z had first come to Lee County that same year as part of a contingent of Vanderbilt University medical students who traveled Appalachia giving out free physical examinations. When he came back 2 years later as a volunteer in a federal government program that sends doctors into poor areas that have few physicians, Van Zee took over a community health clinic in the small Lee County town of St. Charles. St. Charles, which lies at the intersection of several small roads and railroad spurs, had once been an Appalachian boomtown with a hotel, a bank, movie theaters, and restaurants. When Van Zee arrived in 1976, coal digging machines had displaced miners and St. Charles was fast on its way to becoming a ghost town. Mining was still part of the region. Scores of miners and their families continued to live in hardscrabble coal camps, collections of shacks, tar paper shanties, and broken down homes that lined the roads leading to the mines. At regular intervals, a screeching sound, like the scrape of a giant piece of chalk against a blackboard, echoed near mines that were still operating. It was the sequel of Iron Wheels against railway tracks as locomotives slowly eased container cars under a hopper so they could be loaded with coal. Van Zee, tall and gangly, with a salt and pepper beard, could have practiced anywhere, but his father was a Presbyterian minister who had instilled in him the notion that work should be a form of service. So Van Zee performed his work in Lee County, where medical services were painfully scarce, with a missionary's intensity. He organized smoking cessation contests. He brought in experts to perform cancer screenings. He ran fairs that offered prenatal care. He even put together courses on healthier cooking, a hard sell in a part of the country where anything edible runs the risk of being fried. Each year, thousands of people passed through the St. Charles Clinic and were treated for every imaginable illness. For those too sick to come in, Van Zee made house calls, driving out to coal camps. When mining disasters struck, he stood by the mouth of the pits even when the only help he could give them was to those recovering bodies. He was an all-consuming job. He was an all-consuming job. One night, his car was found blocking traffic. He was in the driver's seat, passed out from exhaustion while waiting for a red light to change. On this January night, it took Van Zee about 15 minutes to reach Lee County Hospital, a small but modern facility. The young woman, he was told, had overdosed on a narcotic painkiller called Oxycontin. She had been visiting her parents when she fell out of bed with such a thump that they raced into her room. They found her lying on the floor, comatose and close to death. Narcotics depress the respiratory system, and most fatalities involving them occur because people stop breathing. To revive the woman, hospital physicians had put an emergency breathing tube down her throat and connected it to a respirator. At the time, Van Zee had little experience with Oxycontin. In 2000, the medication was relatively new to the marketplace, and he knew only that it was a time-release painkiller in the same class of drugs as morphine. He had prescribed it only a few times to patients suffering from cancer or those who had undergone numerous surgeries, from back pain without finding relief. Van Zee knew just about everybody in Lee County, but the respirator's mask obscured the patient's face. He picked up her chart and saw her name. 21 years earlier, he had held her as a 3-month-old baby and given her immunization shots. Since then, he had treated her of childhood illnesses and watched her grow into a thriving teenager. He took a deep breath. In recent months, both a local drug abuse counselor and a druggist in Pennington Gap had told Van Zee that Oxycontin had started to show up for sale on the street. Van Zee hadn't paid much attention to their concerns. He had always been conservative when it came to prescribing drugs, and it never would have occurred to him that not all doctors were as scrupulous as he was. He and other adults in Pennington Gap also had yet to realize that what area teenagers already knew. That tablet of Oxycontin, or Oxy, as the drug was called, was the ticket on a great high, to a great high. One of these teenagers, Lindsay Myers, was first tried to drug was had first tried the drug in the spring of 1999 when she was 16, and she took a certain pride in being among the youngest Oxy users she knew. She was a sophomore at Lee County High School, a cheerleader for Lee High's football team, the Generals, and a runner. Lindsay had a round, pretty face, and her brown eyes were offset by dark blonde hair, which she pulled back into a ponytail. She was the kind of girl that boys noticed, and she came from one of the wealthiest families in the area. Her mother's father had founded a company that operated coal mines in Kentucky and Virginia, and Lindsay's father, Johnny, had joined the family business. While most kids at Lehigh walked to school or were lucky to drive hand-me-down cars, she tooled around in a brand new black Jeep Cherokee. It was a far better car than her teachers could afford. Overlooking Pennington Gap, a town of 1800, was the Myers family's large, modern house, which appeared more like an upper-class dwelling in suburban Atlanta than a home in small-town Appalachia. Lindsay wished she lived in Atlanta, a 7-hour drive to the south. She loved visiting the city on shopping trips with her mother, Jane, or going there with friends to attend rock concerts. Like most teenagers in Pennington Gap, she felt bored. There wasn't much to do, see or buy. The city's tiny downtown, 2 blocks straddling railroad tracks, had only a few stores. The main clothing store, Gibson's, displayed dresses that a teenager would have never bought. Most of Pennington Gap's action took place at its east end, where a 2-lane road entered the town. Fast food restaurants clustered near the intersection. Kids from Lehigh liked to hang out at McDonald's, but Lindsay went to Hardee's, which attracted a slightly older crowd for people in their early or mid-20s. They knew better parties and had drugs or knew where to get them. She first tried Oxy while riding around in a car outside Pennington Gap. Lindsay watched a friend pop a small blue tablet into his mouth, and let it sit there for a few minutes before taking it out and wiping it on his t-shirt. He then dropped it into a creased dollar bill and folded the pill into a tight envelope, putting the packet into his mouth. He bit down hard on it and then dumped the crushed powder into a plastic compact disc holder. Lindsay snorted some of it. She didn't get high that first time, but friends kept raving about Oxycontin, and a girlfriend told her about someone dealing oxys in Harlan, Kentucky, a 30-minute drive from Pennington Drive. The 2 girls took off in Lindsay's Jeep and found the address they were looking for. They stopped the car in front of a darkened house. Lindsay handed her friend $150 and waited until she came back with 4 pills. On the drive home, they pulled off the road, crushed the pills, and snorted them. At first, Lindsay felt sick to her stomach, but the nausea quickly passed and a rush of warmth spread through her body as her muscles relaxed. Every tension, every care evaporated. Nothing else had made her feel that way. Back in Pennington Gap, the 2 girls cruised the main drag for a while. Then Lindsay started feeling sleepy. By the time she got home, she couldn't keep her eyes open, and was soon wrapped in a delicious cocoon of sleep. The recreational use of prescription painkillers was nothing new, neither in Lee County or in many other parts of the United States. For decades, some patients and drug abusers had misused popular painkillers sold under names such as percocet, percodan, and Tylox. The active ingredient in those drugs is a narcotic called oxycodone, and each pill typically contained 5 milligrams of oxycodone mixed with 500 milligrams of an over the counter pain reliever, such as aspirin or acetaminophen. Oxycontin was very different. It was pure oxycodone, and the weakest dosage contained 10 milligrams of the narcotic, twice as much as its predecessors. It was also available in much higher dosages, including 20, 40, 80, and 160 milligrams of oxycodone. In terms of pure narcotic firepower, Oxycontin was a nuclear weapon. The drug was first marketed in 1996 by a little known Connecticut company named Purdue Pharma. To produce Oxycontin, Purdue used a patented time release formula that allowed the company to pack large amounts of oxycodone into the drug. The tablet's narcotic payload was released gradually, some reaching the patient's bloodstream within the first hour, and the remainder over the following 11 hours. Oxycontin's time release design, CONTIN, was short for continuous, gave it an edge over older painkillers such as Percocet and Tylox. Patients felt the result of those drugs faster, but they only provided relief for 4 hours, and a pain sufferer might have to wake up in the middle of the night to take another pill. But Purdue Pharma also claimed that Oxycontin would be less appealing than traditional painkillers to drug abusers. Addiction experts have long known that people who abuse drugs are drawn to a drug based on its strength and the speed at which its effect is felt. So it wasn't unreasonable to theorize that Oxycontin, with its time release design, would give drug abusers a quick high. It didn't take long, however, for even novice abusers like Lindsay Myers to discover that an Oxycontin tablet, softened up with a little water or saliva, could be crushed to yield its oversized narcotic payload all at once. Before long, Lindsay was scoring 1 or 2 oxys a day. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, the federal agency that polices the manufacture, shipping, and dispensing of prescription drugs, had placed Oxycontin within the most tightly controlled category of medications, so-called Schedule II narcotics. Oxycontin's classmates in Schedule II included such other powerful and potentially addictive painkillers as morphine, dilaudid, and fentanyl. Under federal law, every gram of these substances is supposed to be tracked and accounted for as it moves from manufacturer to distributor and from distributor to doctor and druggist. Lindsay bought most of her pills from a woman nicknamed Shorty, who lived in a small, dilapidated house near the center of Pennington Gap. No one knew where Shorty got her drugs, but it was not through legitimate channels. In the summer of 1999, Lindsay hung out and got high. She would pick up her friends and drive out of Pennington Gap on a narrow country lane called Skaggs Hill Road, which meandered through rugged farm country and onto Skaggs Hill, known as Pill Hill, before circling back to town. Lindsay and her friends would pull off on one of the road's many turnouts, crush oxys, and snort them. As the weeks passed, Lindsay and her friends had more and more company. Some days she saw a different car of users pulled off along the side of Skaggs Hill Road every quarter mile or so. It was during the 4th of July weekend that Lindsay had her first glimpse of the drug's dark side. Her muscle hosted her uncle hosted an annual family reunion at his lakefront summer home in Tennessee. Lindsay hadn't brought any oxys with her, and on her first night away, her legs began to hurt, even in bed. She couldn't keep them from shaking. Mom, my legs are hurting bad, Lindsay called out. Would you rub on them? Jean massaged her daughter's legs and soothed her to sleep, but the next night the pain was worse. Lindsay's cramps weren't cured until she got back to Pennington Gap, drove over to Shorty's house, and brought some oxys. She awoke the next morning feeling good and a little scared. She hadn't thought she would become addicted to the pills, at least not this easily. Later that day, Lindsay told Shorty that she might be hooked. Jane Myers didn't know anything about Shorty, but by the fall of 1999, she had started to worry about her daughter. Lindsay had trouble getting up in the morning. Her interest in school had fallen off, and she had quit the track team. Jane's sister told her she had seen Lindsay hanging out with an older girl who had a reputation for doing drugs. She suggested that Jane would find Lindsay a summer job, maybe one at the office of the family's coal business. To Jane, a reserved and attractive woman with red hair, the idea of Lindsay doing drugs was inconceivable. She was a teenager and maybe she was going through some kind of phase, but Jane believed her daughter was at an age where she deserved more independence. Jane thought that Lindsay would talk to her about it if she was having a problem. She didn't want to intrude too much on Lindsay's privacy. Besides, Lindsay seemed to be enjoying cheerleading at football games as much as ever. Jane loved to watch her daughter perform. She would often drive her to away games, even if it meant a 3-hour trip each way. One evening in the fall of 1999, Lindsay walked in from a game, threw her bag onto the kitchen table, and went downstairs to join her brother and his friends in the basement. On an impulse, Jane decided to open Lindsay's bag. Inside, she found a small tablet and a thin metal tube about an inch long. Jane didn't have a clue what they were. Lindsay, she called into the basement, I want to ask you something. Lindsay came up and looked nonchalantly at the pill that her mother was holding. Oh, I haven't been able to sleep, she told Jane. Kimberly gave me that to help. Kimberly, who was Lindsay's cousin, was also at the house that night, and after Lindsay went back to the basement, Jane showed her the pill and asked, Did you give Lindsay this? I haven't given her anything, Kimberly replied. Jane felt her stomach drop. She shouted for Lindsay to come upstairs. Kim didn't give you this pill, she said. What is it? It's an oxy, Lindsay said, with an abstinent, challenging look. And what's this? Jane asked, holding up the short, hollow tube. That's what I used to snort it, said Lindsay. With that, Lindsay stormed off into her room. The next morning, Jane called Beth Davies, who ran Pennington Gap's substance abuse clinic. Davies said she didn't know how much about Oxycontin, but she told Jane that the only way to really know what was going on was to have Lindsay's urine screened. Jane balked at the idea. She told Beth that making Lindsay submit to such a test wasn't fair. If someone found out she had been tested, rumors would follow. Her school record might be blemished. She might even be thrown off the cheerleading squad. Jane said she wouldn't approve a test, but she agreed to bring Lindsay to Davies' office to talk. Beth Davies, a small, feisty woman with a gravelly voice and a shock of short, silver hair, was as unlikely a substance abuse counselor as one might find. In 1999, she was 66 years old, but she looked a good decade younger and had the energy of someone half her age. She was also a nun. Sister Beth, as many people called her, had first come to Appalachia in 1972 after working in parochial schools in New York and Connecticut as a teacher and administrator. She decided she wanted to become more involved in environmental battles, and not long after her arrival in Lee County, she helped lead the fundraising drive to build the health clinic in St. Charles, where Art Van Zee worked. Then in 1979, Davies lost her own long running battle with alcoholism. She entered a church owned treatment facility in Massachusetts for nuns with substance abuse problems and decided to change careers. She went to Rutgers University in New Jersey for training in substance counseling and spent a year in the roughest neighborhoods of Trenton, New Jersey, working with alcoholics and heroin addicts. Since the mid 1980s, Davies and Elizabeth Vines, another nun who battled alcoholism, had run the addiction education center in an old two-story building in downtown Pennington Gap. Initially, the two women worked almost exclusively with alcoholics, but in the early 1990s, they began to see an increase in the abuse of medications, including tranquilizers and the prescription painkillers, along with Percocet and Tylox. Those drugs included Vicodin and Lortab, two popular prescription painkillers that contain hydrocodone, another narcotic. The medical establishment believed that hydrocodone posed a lower addiction threat than oxycodone, and federal regulations governing hydrocodone containing drugs were looser, making them easier for doctors to prescribe. But none of these drugs had prepared Davies and Vines for Oxycontin. Lindsay spent an agonizing weekend waiting for her appointment with Beth Davies. Over those 48 hours, Lindsay went through withdrawal, the physical equivalent of shock. When patients or drug abusers use a narcotic, they develop dependence, a natural process in which the body adapts to the powerful effects of an opioid. Physical dependence is an addiction, but if patients or abusers are suddenly deprived of the drug, they will go into withdrawal. For Lindsay, who had been doing 3 oxys a day, one before school, one at lunch, and one before cheerleading practice, the process was excruciating. Her legs ached and jerked far more painfully than they had at her uncle's house. She had flu-like symptoms such as chills, a running nose, and severe headaches. She even suffered periods of delirium. One night that weekend, Lindsay dreamed that she had found an oxy in her room and snorted it. When she woke up and realized it hadn't happened, she began to cry. By Monday, Lindsay was looking forward to seeing Beth Davies. Her mother hadn't told her much about the drug counselor, but Lindsay assumed that Beth was young because her name sounded that way. Lindsay imagined that Beth might become a slightly older friend in whom she could confide. Jane and Lindsay didn't speak much to each other as they drove downtown in the family Mercedes. But as soon as Lindsay walked into Beth Davies' office and saw her, she shut down. There was no way they would ever connect. She decided Beth was way too old. "Can you tell me why you are here?" Davies asked her. "I haven't done anything," Lindsay said. Apparently, apparently something is concerning your mother, or she wouldn't have called," Davies replied. "What do you think it is?" "I'm okay," Lindsay said. She's really making too much of this. She wanted me to come, so that's why I'm here." Lindsay and Beth didn't forge a connection. But for a month afterward, Lindsay managed to stay clean. Then one afternoon, she was cruising around town and saw a friend at a gas station. Lindsay pulled in, and the girl gave her a big hug. "Man, I wish I could find something," Lindsay said. "You're in luck," her friend replied. Years later, no one in Lee County would be able to pinpoint the precise moment in 2000 that OxyContin abuse exploded in their midst. Not, not physicians like Art Van Zee, not drug counselors like Beth Davies, not law enforcement officials, but as the winter of 2000 slid into spring, Oxy seemed to be everywhere. 6 months earlier, in the fall of 1999, the drug had accounted for just a small fraction of police undercover drug buys in southwestern Virginia. But by the following spring, that figure had skyrocketed. In some areas, in 90%, this flood of pills on the streets seemed to have multiple sources. Some unscrupulous doctors were running pill mills, practices where prescriptions are written without a legitimate purpose in exchange for the price of an office visit. Other doctors were fooled into prescribing the drug to abusers who came in pretending to be a patient in pain. People were also forging prescriptions for Oxycontin or making duplicate copies of real ones. Before long, the demand for traditional painkillers like Percocet and Lortab had dried up in Lee County because everyone wanted oxys. It was as if some exotic new specimen had quietly slipped into the local drug supply and driven out the native species. OxyContin's purity made it easy for recreational users to snort it like cocaine, or serious drug addicts to inject it like heroin. On the black market, OxyContin had a value of $1 per milligram, meaning that a 20 milligram strength tablet sold for $20, and a 40 milligram tablet sold for $40. For people like Lindsay Myers, who had thousands of dollars in her bank account, finding the cash to buy oxys wasn't a problem, because most people didn't have that kind of money. Crime accelerated alongside the abuse of OxyContin. Addicts broke into houses and stole cash and televisions. In some cases, cancer and pain patients awoke to find bottles of OxyContin missing from their medicine cabinets. Forged, stolen, and worthless checks began to paper the region. So many of these were for $40, the street price of a $40 milligram oxy, that cops would joke upon finding one. We know where the $40 went. People eager to get the drug ran up huge debts on their credit cards, buying things like buying things they could quickly convert into cash. Those without credit lines shoplifted items like cigarette lighters or compact discs and sold those. In rural southwestern Virginia, chainsaws were popular targets. As the drug abuse intensified, its casualties mounted during the spring of 2000. Each week brought more people into the addiction education center hoping to break their oxy habits. More overdoses were brought into Lee County Hospital on stretchers. Most of those hospitalized were either teenagers or young adults, some with golf ball size abscesses on their arms, a sign they were shooting up the drug with hypodermic needles. By early April, Vince Stravino, a young physician who worked at the hospital with Art Van Zee, decided that he had seen enough. He called the headquarters of Purdue Pharma in Stamford, Connecticut. His call was routed to a physician on the company's staff. "We are having bad problems," Stravino said. "We are having withdrawals. This is a horrible problem." The Purdue doctor said she was surprised to hear that people were abusing the drug and assured Stravino she would look into this complaint. It wasn't until 10 months later that the company filed a required report notifying the Flood and Drug Administration, FDA, of Stravino's phone call. That filing read, In part, physician reports that unidentified patients, children, teenagers, and adults, using oxycontin controlled release oxycodone hydrochloride for unknown reasons come to the hospital with overdoses and abscesses because of injections. Reportedly, children in the area are crushing, snorting, and injecting oxycontin. Additional information is being requested. Purdue Pharma's report to the FDA also made reference to a follow up phone call from Stravino that came 2 months after the first. Additional information received that on the 5th of June 2000 from the reporting physician identifies one patient, a 15-year-old Caucasian male who illegally obtained OxyContin 40 milligrams, milligram tablets. Reportedly on the 7th of April 2000, the patient took an unknown amount of OxyContin and was found unable to walk, talk coherently at school. Reportedly, the events ended the same date, and the patient had a complete recovery. At the time of this report, the patient is undergoing an inpatient treatment. The reporting physician determined that the events were definitely related to OxyContin. Art Van Zee had a hard time coming to grips with the havoc unfolding around him. Throughout the spring of 2000, he remained focused on the same public health problems in Lee County that had long been his areas of interest, such as teenage pregnancies and infant nutrition. But his concerns about OxyContin were growing. Vance liked research and numbers, so he asked a young medical student to conduct a survey at Lee High that would ask students about their use of tobacco, alcohol, and both legal and illicit drugs. He was stunned when he saw the results. 20% of the 11th graders and 20% of the 12th graders in Lee High said they had tried OxyContin. It was then that Van Zee understood something new was happening in his small corner of Appalachia. Something beyond bad things that always happened there. Joblessness and problems with alcohol and drugs that seemed to follow from one generation to the next. But he still wondered why it had emerged. Then in May, Stravino, a big soccer fan, flew to Boston to see a match. He picked up a copy of the Boston Globe and stood transfixed as he read the article in the newspaper about the rampant abuse of a new painkiller in Maine. The article reported that the drug Oxycontin was for sale virtually everywhere in rural Washington County, which was located in the state's northern tip. People were traveling hundreds of miles to con prescriptions from doctors by complaining about back pain or migraines. The area had once been a place where people left their doors unlocked, but now crime had surged and drug treatment centers had been overrun. The situation had reached such a crisis that the United States Attorney in Maine wrote to doctors throughout the state, warning them be vigilant to be vigilant when prescribing OxyContin. As soon as Stravino got back to Pennington Gap, he showed the article to Van Zee. And that is the end of chapter 1 of Painkiller. And we are under an hour right now, which is fine. We'll pick it up next week. So I hope you all found that book interesting and that you guys will be excited about the next chapter coming up in the coming weeks. So, the new chapters coming up in the coming weeks. So, anywho, I hope you all enjoyed tonight's video, and I hope you all have a fantastic evening. Again, I'm the Epileptic Explorer, and I hope you all have a fantastic evening. Please write on my videos, and please subscribe and press the give this video a thumbs up and press the bell icon for more videos to come. So until then, this is the Epileptic Explorer, and I hope you all have a fantastic evening.